We'll go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our 7th Symposia session on leadership skills. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind everyone to please mute your mics when you're not speaking. And also, we are going to cover everyone's questions that were sent in prior to the session. So thank you to everyone who did send in their questions. We'll answer them during the question breaks. So also feel free to use chat function throughout the webinar to send in your questions or just speak up when we do break for questions. So our speaker today is Greg Hilbrick. Greg is the Treasurer and Senior Vice President of Taxation at Oracle. In his current role, he leads the company's global tax and treasury function. His key responsibilities have included oversight of a wide range of tax and related controversies throughout the world. So before joining Oracle, he held a similar role at First Data Corporation and was a partner at a large law firm. So on that note, I will hand it off to Greg.
Thanks, Shannon. I appreciate it. And welcome. Hi, everybody. I guess I was thinking about this. Probably the place I should start is with a bit of a disclaimer, which is to say I'm not really an expert on this topic of leadership, if anyone really is. And I've certainly been doing it for a while, so I've lived it. And probably the school that I really went to is the school of hard knocks. I got just as Shannon said, I was a partner in a law firm, and then went in-house and initially was the head of planning for a very acquisition-oriented, transaction-oriented company. And one day I got a call from the CFO who said, it was a new CFO actually, said, "Congratulations, you're now the head of tax. And we're going to be moving the finance function from Atlanta, where it was then located, to Denver. And I need to know by Monday whether you think we should move the tax function or not." So that's how I kind of got thrown into everything. And then it's been all, kind of figuring it out from there. And I've certainly got a lot of stuff wrong over the years. But I am a student of the topic, and I read a lot about it, and I think a lot about it, and I take it seriously. And so basically what I'm just going to be doing is telling you, sort of what I've distilled down in the way I approach things, which, may or may not be the right thing in any given situation. But I think the principles, from what I've been able to see, are pretty cross-applicable to a lot of different situations. So starting with the definition that I put on the slide here, leadership can be defined as a process through which an individual influences a group to achieve a common goal. And I think I cribbed that from Peter Drucker or somewhere. That's probably one of many classic definitions that you can find. But I think it encapsulates everything that is essential in the definition or what's required. And I sort of organized it around the 3 P's, which is nicely alliterative. So which were people, purpose, and process. And I'm going to be talking about each one of those. That's sort of the organizing theme. And the other way to sort of think about those, and I reference a book here called Good to Great by Jim Collins, which I read that book. Probably a lot of you have read it already. I read that about 4 or 5 years into my 20-year journey of as head of these finance functions, and it completely resonated with me. I'd figured out, I think, a lot of it already, but I actually learned a lot, and I've read it a few times since then. And his version in the book of people, purpose, and process is his way of saying it much more colorfully is get the right people on the bus. So who's on the bus? Where's the bus going, and how does the bus get there? Which is, and I'll talk about each one of those, like I said, in turn. And I think one thing to sort of say off the top is that the thing I'm going to focus on as we go through this is the sort of leadership of the organization itself in sort of a downward sense. So I'm not going to talk much about, because leadership is a wide variety of things. And as you can see from the definition, it's basically about influencing people. And of course, you're influencing, cross-chain all the time. So your peers and other groups and within the finance function and within the business units. And you're also influencing up. And of course, influencing up and managing up is probably the number one prerequisite for the job, because if you don't keep the boss happy, obviously you can end up with sort of a fairly short tenure, but you can also change or affect what the boss's view of what's appropriate. But I'm not going to talk about those things because I think all of that is inherent in the jobs leading up to the top job, in the sense that, I know when I was head of planning, when I was in the law firm, it was a project-oriented roles, and I did have people, working for me, but sort of, loosely, clustered around projects, essentially. And in those roles, it was all about influencing cross-chain, and to some extent influencing up, but heavily influencing cross-chain, because as I always like to say, it's about getting people to do well in a planning. You're basically trying to twist people into a pretzel a lot of times. And so I always describe it as getting people to do things they don't really want to do and still like you in the process. But when you get the top job, it's sort of interesting because in some sense, it's a lot easier because you now have control over the people that you're influencing, and you have a lot of levers that you can pull that you weren't able to pull before. You directly control compensation. Is probably the biggest single thing, and so you can, in a lot of ways, the ability to influence the people who work for you is much easier. But at the same time, I know, at least for me, I went from having a small handful of people working for me to close to 100 in the matter of an hour, and so it's a different thing, and a different skill set, and it's also a tremendously bigger opportunity in the sense that you have an opportunity to mold an entire organization and make a lot more of a difference. And one other thing that I would sort of mention on the sort of general overview is that the three elements, although I do them in an order, and it's an order that is sort of the book, to the extent it's an empirical book, indicates that you need to do things in the order, which is people first, and then purpose, and then process. That ultimately those three things are mutually reinforcing, and it's a wonderful thing. And in my experience, it sort of fits tightly into a package of you sort of each one reinforces the other, and I'll sort of talk about that as I go through the more specific sections. So that flips us over to the slide, which I've called First Who, Then What, which is basically the concept that the most important thing is to get the right people on the bus. And in some way, that's a little bit counterintuitive, or at least it was to me, in the sense that it seems in some sense that you should figure out where you're going before you figure out who you're going with. But I actually think that I sort of quickly realized that was not actually true. And it's sort of interesting. Like I've basically the four functions that I've run, which is 2 treasury functions and 2 tax functions, and I sort of took them all over at different times. But all of them were, in some sense, I think turnaround is not exactly the right word, but basically where, in my estimation, each one of those functions basically needed to be remade, and especially in the first situation that I was talking about, when basically my answer to the question, should we move this function to Denver, was yes, for a variety of reasons. And then I sort of commenced on, a plan of essentially, keeping the existing team working in their current jobs while sort of remaking the function in Denver and transferring it across the country. And I sort of quickly realized, because I was still doing my old job, which was, and again, this is a very acquisitive company, so I had a whole lot of stuff going on at one time. So I had to do this new job, which I was ill-equipped to do, and I had to do my old job at the same time. And I very quickly realized that I was not going to get anything done trying to do it myself because I sort of had my hands more than full with the old job. So I realized very quickly I needed to build out the team underneath me. And that was the first thing before anything else got done. And more or less, I've sort of carried that philosophy through to all of my different jobs, because the essence of the job is basically leveraging other people. And obviously, it's not about what you can do yourself. And so, I think one principle I have always had is that you hire from the top down to the extent that you have that luxury. And I pretty much, when I've come in, I've evaluated the people that are in place and determined who's a good fit for their current jobs, and then basically install those people, and then hire sort of from the top layers, and then hire down, so that there's sort of buy-in throughout the organization. And everybody, sort of buys into who's working for whom, which is, one of the key things I think that's very helpful in terms of alignment. The process of figuring out who's on the bus and sort of making those selections, which is a much trickier thing to do when you have an existing team. And the book, Collins in his book talks a lot about this element, like how do you decide who's on the bus and what process do you go about to make those choices. They use the expression in the book, or he uses the expression rigorous, not ruthless. And I've always used this sort of analogous language, I think, or similar language, which is demanding but fair, and which was, for me, all about setting the standard and a very high bar, and giving everyone a chance to meet it. And when people ultimately see that they can't meet it, ultimately they usually opt out, and then you end up with the right people on the bus. One pressure that you get is to, in my situations, was to hire, right away. And you always have the pressure to hire if you have an open slot. But another principle that I sort of lived by over the years, and again, sort of the school of hard knocks, which is to, when in doubt, keep looking, is the way I expressed it here, which is basically, and I think everybody knows this, hiring mistakes really are costly, and that's not just a cliche, they are. So, we basically, over the years, we have a very rigorous hiring system, which we continue to refine, because we still make mistakes sometimes. Over time, I think we've made fewer of them, and we put a lot of time and effort and rigor into our hiring process here. I personally, for example, anybody who would be a direct report to me, I spend many hours with them, probably close to 10 hours, really getting to know and understand them, because and making sure that they fit, and trying to be very honest about how the organization works to see if it's a good fit, because getting that right is huge. And we collectively have adapted, very rigorous process around, questions. And we have very detailed scenarios that we go through with people and ask very detailed questions, because getting those decisions right is tremendously important. And
hey, Greg, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
This is Mark Leniato from BNSF. We're going through a hiring process right now, and one of the things that I found that's the most difficult is making sure that the person can do the work without, putting them through the paces. And we've tried various things. And most recently, what we tried is we threw out a bunch of briefs, and we had them review it, and then sit down and talk to who they're going to work for, and discuss the legal issues for an hour, and that was a pretty good way to get a feel for them. I'm just curious, what sorts of things do you do to actually test out their technical skills for tax?
Yeah, that actually sounds like a great idea. What I think the thing that we found, which works, I think has worked pretty well, which is, I think basically along the same principle that as what you described, which is to have people take a couple of projects, or depending on the job basically, but that they've worked on, and have them and I tell them, pick out something that really well, because we're going to go really deep on this thing. And then I have the candidates, and everybody on the team basically does this, and we try to have them do it with different projects. Have them describe in detail, what was the project, first of all. And I tell people, just educate me, like I am, a 2-year-old essentially, and I know nothing about what you're talking about. And I have people go to the board. I have them draw, here's the basic scenario. What were you trying to accomplish? And then I keep, and this is basically the way we run the function here, is I keep drilling down and asking questions and trying to understand it and treat it essentially as if it's a live project that we have here. And, both as a matter of substance, you can very quickly tell, how people think through problems, to some extent what they know. And then, as part of all that, we also try to go through, scenarios and, like what actually happened and what did you do? So in addition to being able to explain it all conceptually and technically, we will say, I'll say, okay, so tell me, how did that project come in the door? And then, so what was the first call? And then walk me through step by step exactly what happened and exactly what you did. And then you sort of can ferret out from that. I found this works really well, because you sort of can figure out what are all the power dynamics in the particular project, who did they need to influence, and all that stuff. And then I just keep asking specific questions about, well, that's interesting. I mean, wasn't the controller upset about that because of, blah, blah, blah. And then, I listen to them respond very specifically. And I may take, an hour and a half, even with a relatively low level person, and sort of go through those things in tremendous detail. And what I have found is people cannot fake that. And you find out very quickly, how they react in situations, and, how they, like I said, how they think about problems. And it's sort of similar to what you're describing. And when we've hired for, legal writing jobs and things, obviously I get writing samples, that sort of thing. But I think what you said is exactly right. It's getting people in situations that they know, and then understanding really what do they know and what can they do. So that's
that's really good advice. I mean, we've tried that as well, and it's worked effectively. I think the only time it doesn't really work is if it's a fairly low level position where somebody didn't really have the project under their belt. They were more the helper, and that's why we came up with our own sort of project for them to go through. But I mean,
even at the lower levels, it's interesting, because I would say, we're doing it in the same level of rigor. It's just at a lower level, so the expectations are lower. If somebody it's sort of interesting. People will come in and they're basically transferring numbers from one spreadsheet to another, and you'll say, well, that's interesting. So why do you do that? Or whatever. We're checking this column against that column, and it's like, well, that's interesting. Have you ever found a situation where the two columns didn't match? And sometimes people say no, and it's like, well, that's interesting. Somebody's been doing this job for however long, and basically all they're doing is confirming what's there. But it's interesting, by asking detailed questions, I found that no matter what level people are at, you can figure out, what they know and how much they've thought about what they're doing. It may or may not be relevant for a given job, but anyway, it's interesting. I think it sounds like we're all up against the same. Of course we are, right? There's everybody's figured out that getting these decisions right is pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think it's just hard to find the people.
Yeah, that's true too. And it's interesting because there's a war for talent out there, and there's not enough talent to go along. And part of it is it's sort of interesting because it's a screening process, but it's also a selling process at the same time. And it's interesting because I think in our case we're trying to attract people. And this is sort of a nice segue into the next thing, which who fit into our culture, and which is a very rigorous and analytic culture. And so in some sense the process is it's very daunting for a lot of people, and a lot of people opt out after going through the process voluntarily, or we opt them out. But the ones that we're trying to attract actually love that, because they get a chance to show off what they know and what they can do. And so the rigor of the process itself is a little bit of a selling exercise. I think another thing, that I sort of in part because in an ideal world you get somebody who's got the right background, the perfect background of match and the perfect set of attributes. But those people are, in my experience, are few and far between, and it's become. I've made the judgment over time, and I think that essentially we hire for attributes over knowledge. And I've almost reached the conclusion I don't care how much tax somebody knows, because I think we found that sometimes hiring people who know virtually nothing or have been hanging around the field for a year or two, the really best people figure it out quickly and learn it and get up to speed and surpass people who have been doing it for years and years. And so we've actually, been very careful when we define job searches. What are we looking for? At first people put in, I need somebody with a master's in tax or blah, 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 whatever it is, an LLM or something. And I'm like, why? Who cares about that? Because the only thing that actually matters is, are they going to, and not only even can they do the job on day one, but are they going to be able to get up to speed, very quickly? And so we basically are screening for, I think the things I've listed there, it really comes down to those four things, which is, the desire and the ability to learn. And it's both, people who love to learn and people who can learn. And the learning that's required is different for different jobs. So sub jobs are intensely analytic, and you need people who are, sort of talented analytically. I think our hiring process helps tease that out. But it doesn't really matter, in my experience, what you actually know, because, like I said, if you've sort of been hanging around, analytic areas like engineering or finance or law, you probably have, if you're good at it, you probably have the innate ability to figure stuff out. And the same thing with people, and different job. The ideal person is great with people, and they're great analytically. And I think we like people who are good at and like working with other people, because those skills, when it comes to getting stuff done, obviously that's huge. And again, we try to test that through our situational interviewing. I think ownership is something that I found is huge, which is, the way I sort of define that is, people who don't let the egg fall on the floor and do whatever it takes. And, it's sort of interesting because I think we're very flexible around all our, working requirements and all that stuff. It doesn't matter, when or how much you work, as long as you get the job done. And, I think for us, people who will not, allow things to fail is a huge thing. And here that's a key requirement. And then the other one that's sort of interesting, and probably everybody's figured this out as well, which is you got to put the organization first. So we screen very heavily. There's various names for this here, but one of them is the no ego rule, which is, anybody who's more interested, in how they're doing and how they're looking, not that those things aren't important, but they're basically just, disruptive to the process. So we try really hard to hire people. I think the old vernacular was team players, but people who basically care more about doing a good job than they care about, how they're doing. And it's sort of interesting, like when, we were talking about this before this call, when you just hire for those things, and it's not really the goal, but the consequence of that is you end up with this incredible diversity, because people who have those attributes come from all walks of life. I think we have represented in our groups here something like 40 countries around the world. It's like a United Nations. Everybody speaks a different language, but of course they all speak English. But ultimately, obviously, and we end up with people with completely different backgrounds, and we have the obvious accountants and lawyers here, but we also have a number of engineers, we have people in PhD math and physics programs, we have English lit majors, and we even have, it's sort of interesting, like in the people from work environments. I mean, we were having trouble hiring people in the sales tax area that we thought were good, and so we ended up hiring some people who had completely different careers. And then went back to law school, and so we hired somebody who was actually sold cars for about 25 years, but who's a very smart person and sort of learned everything there is to learn about sales tax within a matter of 2 years. We hired a woman who ran a Red Lobster. I mean, it's sort of interesting because none of that stuff, actually matters. And then we end up with people who, score very differently on like Myers-Briggs scores and stuff like that. So some people who are more interested in figuring out what to do and how it works and figuring things out, and other people who like to get things done. The ideal person, will do both, but we don't need both because we do, a team environment. And so so it's sort of interesting. Like if you kind of look at it, like people have those 4 things in common, but everything else they do not have in common at all. And, what I found is that really opens the field, and it gets us at least, the people that we want. And obviously we don't always get what we want, and it's a struggle. But anyway, so this is, I think, maybe I should come up for air a little bit here and see if people want to, talk and ask other questions. Shannon, it sounded like you have some people who, sort of wrote in.
A couple of questions come in beforehand. So the first one is, how do you balance the need to hire for technical skills and the need to hire for leadership skills, knowing that the candidates that are proven in both areas are the highest paid in the market?
Yeah, and I think I probably answered that, already. And in part, I think it depends on the job and what's needed. And I think, everybody has got to have a minimum in the human skill department, and everybody's got to meet a minimum threshold in the analytic skills department, I think is the way we do it. And then, how high you go once you meet those 2 minimum thresholds, most people have there's not, they're not, like you said, like this question implies, top of the charts in both. And so, we basically have a mix of people some people who are super analytically and, pretty good in human skills, and some people who are, super in human skills and good analytically, but not necessarily great. And then we mix and match those depending on the projects that are available. And, I think people, they like to work in areas that, that they're good at and they shine at. And so the sort of project-based assignment of jobs sort of ensures that we've got, or the ideal is anyway, that it ensures that we've got the right mix of people on any given project. And then, we try to get as many people as we can who have both. But, it is a struggle. There's a war for talent, and we definitely don't pay at the top, almost by design, because I also have found that, anybody who's working primarily for the money isn't probably going to fit very well in this organization either. So we try to pay, below market a little bit, not much. And then if people work out, then they do, well here ultimately. So did you have another one, Shannon? Or?
Yep. The next one is, what are some leadership qualities that you look for in a candidate when considering someone for a role that is stretching their current experience with leadership, and how can you tell that you are making a safe bet?
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think it's also kind of funny because I don't think we necessarily try to hire people who are already leaders, and it comes back to the attributes over knowledge kind of thing, or experience. I guess really experience is the right word here, because and I think it's great to hire somebody with experience in leadership, but it's pretty hard to know anyway, just from by somebody's title, how good they were at what they did. I mean, the fact that somebody led some organization really, to me, doesn't prove anything, because there's a reasonably good chance they, in my assessment, wouldn't have done a very good job of it. So I actually don't look for experience on that. Sometimes, in some ways, I think personally, experience is almost a negative, and because people have certain expectations and stuff coming in. So I think we're trying to screen for that. In our situation-based interviews, and that's where I go through not only, how did you think about the problem, but how did you execute on the problem? Tell me every single step, and then you can, I think, to the best of our ability, we can figure out how people, responded in a given situation, and people, for example, you can ferret out, I think, people who don't like conflict, from those situations, because, all their questions will be conflict avoidant. And it's like, well, that's interesting. Wouldn't this person have been irritated by this? And then they're like, well, yeah, but then, so, well, what did you do about it? And then, you sort of get, sometimes the blank stare, or people fumble around and they don't say, well, look, I figured out that, this person was motivated by this thing and that thing. And then, I tried this, and then I tried that, and then I tried this. And so, I mean, what I sort of found is it doesn't actually matter whether you've done formal leadership before. It's about whether you have the innate. It's not even innate. These are learned things, but I think it comes easier for some people than others, where you've got the ability to understand other people and their motivations and how to persuade and convince them. And so we put a lot of people in, sort of leadership, so-called leadership positions, because everybody's leading, really, like the definition, in leadership positions that have never had any formal leadership at all. And very often they perform much better than the people who have. I think it just depends on the person. So anyway, that's my sort of 2 cents on that. I don't know does anybody want to talk any more about any of that stuff?
Just one quick question. Do you do any type of leadership assessment when people come on board through like outside third party?
We don't do that, and maybe we should. I mean, it sounds like, is that something you've done?
Yeah, our BNSF does that for a certain level and above. They'll do a full day assessment, and if they comes back negative, the person more or less doesn't get hired. And then if it comes back positive and you do get hired, then you have like a year of follow-up for development. And then, at certain levels in the company, like before I would get promoted to VP, I had to go through it again at a higher level.
Well, that sounds great, actually. I mean, what's your experience? It sounds great. I mean, what's your experience with that? I guess you don't know the people you didn't hire. I mean, are there people who you otherwise thought would have been good that didn't pass the screening? And I guess those people who passed the screening, do they end up typically working out?
I think generally they do. I think it's not testing even though it's got an analytical side that it tests, it's testing for leadership. So, and it puts people in role-playing positions, and PhDs are in there grading it, and they'll give you a somewhat objective thing, and it's benchmarked not against other tax people, but against other leaders in the company and other leaders outside the company. So it puts us tax people sort of at a disadvantage. So if you are high up in a law firm or something, you never led anybody, but you're really good at what you do, you're not going to necessarily be as good as some guy at the railroad that's managing 2,000 people for the last 20 years.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because you would think that, for a technical job, they wouldn't be screening for, ability to lead a 2,000 person organization. I mean, in some ways, it sounds like the tools are fantastic, and your organization sounds like it's really invested in, screening people, but it also sounds like maybe some of these things are being over applied if they're preventing you from hiring people where that don't have skills that you don't actually need for the particular position.
Well,
that's interesting.
I mean, that's the reaction I used to have, but now I actually have the opposite reaction. I think those leadership skills are extremely important, and I'm pretty high on myself. I think we do a good job screening out, but we've got a guy going through that. I think today or yesterday he went through, and I hope he passed, but I won't know until I get the results. And he's already been through all our screening.
Sounds great. I mean, I'd say, both companies I worked at were sort of, very kind of action oriented and spent virtually no time or effort on the touchy feely stuff. And I don't say that in a denigrating way, because I put a ton of effort into this, and I'd say I've been an outlier in both organizations I've worked in. And so it sounds like you're very fortunate to, and actually it's interesting. I mean, it sounds like that's another idea for me, which is to look into possibly getting more objective assessments from, experts around some of these things that, maybe, we here are not as good as we think we are at doing those things. I mean, that's another great thought.
Yeah, and just the leadership I view exactly the same as what you said on the technical side. I don't think leadership's innate at all. I think that it can be learned and developed, and I think you can have somebody that's really nice and brilliant, but a crappy leader, just because they have no knowledge or experience of what a good leader is.
Oh, totally. Yes, I agree with you. And you sort of get into the whole nature-nurture discussion on, how much is learnable, but certainly a lot more than people think can be learned. But I think some things do come easier for some people as well. But yeah, it's great stuff. So I guess moving to sort of the next section, which is the purpose section, which is, this is the sort of where are we going kind of thing. And it's sort of interesting, like at the highest level in the book Good to Great, they talk about the hedgehog concept, and the great companies are the ones that have sort of focused on a particular, area and try to really be great at that area. I think that principle is sort of defined for us in tax and finance functions, in that, it's pretty clear. I think at a high level, we already are sort of constrained to be within the hedgehog concept. So we're not trying to be everything to everybody. We're trying to be, great tax leaders, and that's, specific enough that that particular concept, I think, doesn't have, so much meaning. But I think the the sources of what you're trying to do obviously is in part dictated by the organization itself, and clearly your boss or the people above you are the number one things, and what they say, obviously. And it's sort of interesting because when I got here, I came in and it took me about, I told my boss it's taking about 3 months to make an assessment of what's going on, in the organization here. And then I'll come up and we'll talk about that and, what I think. And it's sort of interesting because that conversation turned into basically a 10-hour conversation. It was very interesting. And, it was started out, it was scheduled for an hour, and we ended up just extending it. It went over 2 days. And that whole conversation was around, what, as somebody from the outside, where tax is a bit of a black box, what to her was a bit of a mystery, and the company had gotten in some trouble on some things before. And, it's like, well, how do we know? And that conversation was really around assessing the mutual, the risk tolerance of her and the company in general. And it was a very interesting thing, because having sort of established that, that would set the framework for everything that's happened. And I've been in this job basically 12 years now. Everything that's happened since was sort of framed by that initial conversation, and it was, I'm very lucky to have a boss that was so astute and so receptive to having that conversation. It was really just turned into a dialogue, and it was fantastic. And of course, I mean, part of what you're figuring out is a lot of it's about risk and reward and where you are on that, it's the finance concept, the efficient frontier of risk and reward. And of course, human nature sets an asymmetric risk reward balance. And, people, love the reward until the bad thing happens. And then they, sort of, cast blame everywhere. And so you have to be, in my experience, I'm very careful about, taking risks, that everything is very considered, and it takes a significant reward to sort of outweigh meaningful risk. At least that's the way I said it, and I think that's consistent. Personally, that's what I'm comfortable with, and that's basically been consistent with the risk reward profile of the companies that I've worked for. And if it weren't, I probably wouldn't work for those companies. Having said all that, I think obviously the tax people influence a lot what the organization understands and what they even understand is possible. And I remember reading Jack Welch's autobiography after he left GE, and he was talking about how when John Samuels got to GE, that John was just basically came in and got involved in a deal. I think he had done some transaction work in his law firm, and basically, saved a deal and created a $300 million tax opportunity or something, and the deal would have fallen apart. They got to buy it, and it came to Welch's attention, and he basically said, "Oh my God, I can't believe this one guy has been able to create all this value and salvage this deal." And pretty much gave John carte blanche to hire 1,400 people, however many people they had, and create this entire organization, because that was, to me, was a classic example of somebody educating senior management on what's possible, and if you do that, then obviously they'll throw a lot of resources your way. But I think so given the sort of general parameters determined by the organization itself and how much you're able to influence the organization, then in terms of developing the team, I think the way I've always thought about this is, we together sort of work out the specifics of what that actually looks like and how we will, set the organization to try to achieve the objectives. But part of that is developing the specifics around the objectives as a team. And so in every area, and we've had the senior leadership of the organization, and we usually go down a couple levels for this. We've had, rigorous debates around, what is the goal of each group? And we do define this for each group, aligning it with the risk tolerance of the organization. And we try to, we do a lot of sort of debating about various scenarios and, what is it actually that we're trying to achieve, and then continually refine that, going forward, as we sort of have specific situations and say, well, that's interesting. How does this fit with, sort of the general concept of what the goal is? And then I don't think there's anything terribly new about any of this. I think a lot of it is, for me, I think what's extremely helpful is developing that as a team, because then, people are aligned around what it is that you're actually trying to accomplish. And I think for us, just at a high level, and I think all this stuff is pretty obvious, but on the reporting side, in terms of provision, it's really about accuracy, and we don't want to be off either direction. And so we measure that, and we measure what is the return to close adjustment, and and then try to go back and look at why is it what it is, either direction, whether it's positive or negative, doesn't matter to me or to us. And then we try to take a rigorous look and figure out what exactly is it that caused the this movement. And what, is there a way that we could have gotten it, more accurate the first time? And so everything, we have KPIs around that measure and how we're doing, and we track that over time, and we try to be fair and rigorous about investigating, how well we're doing. On the tax compliance side, it's sort of a different objective. I think it is making sure that we're adopting the planning positions that we've taken fairly and accurately within the return. And then for both of those areas, the other metric we define is efficiency, and how can we take cost and people out of the equation without satisfying quality. And of course, given the trade-off, I'll take accuracy over efficiency every time, but the goal is to try to have both. And I think the way, for us, we're Oracle, we're a big systems company, we're trying to use technology to do everything. And, what we try to do is, this sort of gets into a couple things. So there's KPIs as a tool that I talked about. Another one, which used to be a kind of a big term in the sort of leadership field, was the BHAG, which you don't hear that much anymore, but the big, hairy, audacious goal. And we sort of step back and say, why can't we, a couple of things. We just asked ourselves the question, why can't we file the tax return, because initially it was, 10 months after the end of the year, we're scrambling around trying to get the tax return filed. It's like, why can't we be in a position to file the tax return literally instantaneously on ending, the provision for the year? And by the way, it's just a big algorithm. Why can't computers just do the entire thing? And, which we have christened push the button, which is sort of the holy grail. And, what we're really trying to do then, everything sort of points in that direction. And all of our projects around, in process improvements and how to do better are trying to get to the place where it's all done by computer with a simple push of the button. And we're able to do it instantaneously. What are all the inputs that you need to do that? So there's never any issues around accuracy as well. And then we try to do that in the U.S. and we're still not there yet. And then roll it out to all the foreign reporting and all the stat accounts that we have all the way around the world. So that's sort of what we've done for reporting. For planning, I think ultimately that's the sort of money-making area, and it's the way we've defined it. I think everybody probably thinks of it in this way. Largely is to get the most amount of money for the company for the right level of risk. So we're always well short of the legal line as the goal, but we're also obviously doing our best to optimize things constantly, both in the context of externally driven projects and internally driven projects. And everybody understands that that's the objective, and every discussion we have around any planning project is around those objectives, and we try to rank order them based on how much money is being created for a unit of effort expended, because that's where the marginal benefit, as we define it for our planning projects, is highest. And then in the audit area, I think there's efficiency as a sort of a secondary and far secondary metric. The main one that we use for that is, because it doesn't really, there's a lot of money at stake there as well, is we try to set a truth and justice objective, which is what the sort of the word that we put on it, which is we sort of spend a lot of time at debating on every controversy, and we have lots of those. What do we think is sort of the par outcome, which is some probabilistic assessment. If we were judges deciding things objectively, where would we come out? And then we determine an expected value outcome for every deal. And then that's sort of our true north. The goal is to try to figure out how can we do better than that. Frankly, we try never to do worse than that, and if we can, we try to do better than that. But we know essentially where we're heading. And so for all of these things, in every area, you sort of start with the first principle around the area. Every discussion that we have, which is how does the particular discussion we have fit in with the big picture goal, and sort of work it down from there. And in the next part, I'll talk about, at least how we do this in terms of our process, but because it all feeds together. And when the team, sort of works on this stuff, we have a common understanding of basically what we're trying to achieve. So again, let me sort of come up for air and see if anyone wants to talk about any of that stuff.
I had a question come in, Greg. What is your strategy for staying connected with and ensuring active engagement with a global team?
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to kind of get to that in the third part a little bit, but let me kind of jump into that. I personally am a very hands-on person in the sense that, and this gets into the whole process thing, I want to understand everything that's going on, and so I have sort of an endless appetite for that. Like, I find every problem interesting, and I want to basically understand it. And so I basically have I get a lot of touches, even though it's a big organization. And I think, as I get to in the last part, we have a very inclusive approach to everything. So everything is done in big meetings. Pretty much everybody's invited, who thinks that it's relevant and a good use of their time. And people have gotten pretty good at figuring out what's what. But the upshot, when they should be there, what they should be talking about, and it just sort of works. It's interesting. It's like, there's like the right people just coalesce around the right stuff, because they've sort of figured out, if you're using the principle of, trying to contribute, and basically it's not about you, but it's about your contribution. You sort of know, whether you should be there and whether you're actually going to contribute and add value, in whatever way that is. Sometimes it's just receptive value as opposed to, active value. But so anyway, the upshot of all that is that I basically get a lot of exposure all the time to pretty much, everybody, certainly at the top levels. I mean, I spend, literally probably, 10 hours a day in meetings. And, I'll talk about this as part of the process stuff, but we have, sort of surrounded by whiteboards and, where we're sort of walking through various stages of the projects. And so, people, come in, dial in. We spend a lot of money on equipment and stuff to, make sure. So I basically see, not only what's going on, but who's going on and who's doing what and how they're working and are they working well with the team. And so, we have a lot of, sort of immediate kind of feedback things where, after a meeting, and I think everybody does this with each other, essentially, if, somebody contributes in a way that's unhelpful in the meeting, there'll be a conversation afterwards about how, especially for new people, the people who've been around a while just get it basically, but, here's where, this got off track a little bit and where you could do differently, kind of thing. But so, I personally like that. Like I said, I know pretty much everything that's going on in both Treasury and tax, and I get to see, because we have an open culture of debate, I see basically how everybody thinks and how they interact with each other, at least what's visible. Of course, there's things that that happen that I don't see, obviously, and so I don't know. I think I more or less answered the question.
Greg, do you physically, this is Tony, do you physically go out and visit the off-site locations outside the U.S. much, or do you have them come in, meetings on communication? How's that work? Is it all virtual?
A little of everything. I would say in the beginning, I visited more to try to get a touch and feel of the place and the people and how it all works and all that stuff. And so my first couple of years, I went out, everywhere couple of times, and we have facilities all around the world, as you can imagine. After that, not much. It's not really efficient for me to do that, and so people, I would say, they come here, and I'll talk about this in the sort of our process for decision making, everything, which I've kind of gotten into a little bit here, but. We have a lot of our processes are organized. We have a lot of project-based processes that are organized around projects, and then people, appear for meetings at the appropriate time. And then we have processes for process-based discussions and decision making, and for those, people come from all over the world. There's a week or two, there's a 2-week period every quarter where we have a series of meetings on various areas where people come in from around the world. And it is really like the United Nations around here because, everybody's sort of, there's meetings constantly going on and everybody talks to each other. So, and then every 18 months or so, we have a worldwide global conference, and we do this in both tax and treasury. We do it separately, but where people, come in from all over the world, and we talk about, common experiences. The rest of it, I would say, is virtual, which is to say most of it, and we invest a lot in that. So, Cisco is, which sells these, communication equipment, we're huge customer of theirs, and every, like here at HQ and within the tax and treasury offices here, we have 6 of those machines, which are sort of high intensity communication devices, and then every office has at least a couple of them, because much of our stuff is done on whiteboards, and it's actually interesting. We've gotten very, good at doing that, sharing on the screen, and I'm sure everybody does this, but basically where we have cameras that sort of go around the room and capture what's on the whiteboard, and it's sort of funny, especially once you get to know each other and everybody understands how it works. It's almost as good as being there, and I never thought that would be true, but equipment is so good now, and and after the organization's been going for a while, it works great. So I'd say, summary, probably 5% or 3% or something is me going out. 15% is people coming in, and 80% is virtual, something like that.
And I know you've set up operations in the U.S. at a different location as well. Does that same concept carry over to what you're doing in Denver versus Northern California for you?
Yeah, same concept. So I think, and that's, I actually resisted some of these things for a while, but Silicon Valley is a really hard place to hire because there's, as Tony, there's, too many companies chasing too little talent. Nobody can afford to live here, and it's downright frightening. It even was for me, moving here because houses are so expensive and everything. So, but we are a very group-oriented culture with a very intensely group-oriented dynamic, and so I really resisted, sort of setting up satellite offices. But the thing that actually convinced me that this could work was the fact that it works so well globally. And even, in India, where we've got a very large team of people, and, we're 12 hours different from them, it works incredibly well. And I figured, gosh, if that can work well, we ought to be able to do it in Denver. So I did ultimately, relent on that. And I would say, that is working. That is working well. So other stuff on that? I mean, I think we have kind of gotten into the process part of this, and which at its core really is team analysis. And I think a lot of these things are just cliches as well, but they are so intensely true. I think that all of us is better than one of us, or and it's sort of interesting because there's a lot of expenditure of time and effort that goes into all these meetings. And the meetings, all of them have a defined purpose and goal. Every meeting starts out with the purpose of this meeting is, blah, blah, blah. So we know what it is. And so, we have except for when we're trying to do change management, we have no standing meetings, or where there's something that's dictated by the process where we have our provision meetings. We call those meeting of the mind meetings. And everybody comes in from all over the world, and we debate, essentially what's going to go in our, in our provision. But it's, I mean, for me, I sort of determined early in my, career, even when I was working in a law firm, that you could be in this area. Tax is so complicated, and there are so many exceptions to exceptions to exception, and so many abilities to commit foot faults that you can be 99% right on a problem and get all the way down to the last step and still be 100% wrong because you missed something. And so, I definitely, even though there's a lot of overlap and there's unnecessary, people who may sit in a meeting and not actually contribute for 98% of it, the 2% they do contribute could be essential, to the meeting. So we have a lot of money at stake in our issues, and mistakes are extremely costly, and foregone opportunities are extremely costly. So we invest a lot in having people debate as a group, and that's one reason. I think the second reason for that is that it creates alignment. So, and it's sort of interesting. We were talking about this earlier with Janara. One of the guys that's worked in this system for a couple decades now basically made the observation a couple years ago that it's interesting when you go through this process, which is a lot of the way the consulting firms I think basically do things as well, but you end up where it's pretty obvious what the right decision is to everybody's there. His words are, the decisions just make themselves, because it's very analytically rigorous. So it's all we do probability distributions for everything to the best of our ability. We quantify everything within to right orders of magnitude, at least depending on the level of uncertainty and everything. And it's sort of interesting as you keep drilling down and down and down onto things. At the end of the day, you end up with these probability magnitude distributions where it's pretty obvious what the right choices are. And so, everybody having lived through the process then is aligned. And even if the decisions don't make themselves, it's obvious that it's not clear what's the right choice, that you're sort of taking a risk one way or the other, in which case people are also aligned with the concept that it's not clear, what's the right thing to do. And so when it comes time to execute, then people will, pretty much having understood, what's the goal, why are we doing this, why do we make the choice, they agree with it, or at least they don't disagree with it, and then they're invested in executing against the plan. They know what the plan is, and they know why it's there. They're able to deal with, contingencies and uncertainties because they understand, the transparency with which all decisions are made. And so I think it actually helps in the, with alignment in the execution process as well. And then the other thing is, it's sort of interesting because I think, human nature, people like working with other people, and certainly, we try to attract people like that. But I think it's interesting. You watch documentaries about people in the service, and in Afghanistan and stuff, and they love working with their teammates, or their unit mates or whatever. And when they come back to the U.S., they just miss that camaraderie. And I think that's one of the key things that motivates people. And I think when just as human beings, when we're in working with other people and we're making decisions together as part of an invested process, I think people just like that. And and I think we've had extremely good retention for people, despite paying probably a little bit below average. And I think that's a lot of it, because I think people really love the process of working with other people. And certainly, like I said, there's a selection bias there because we're actually selecting for that. So that's kind of why we do it, I guess. And this particular thing, I think what it looks like, for us is kind of what I described. And it's as I said, I think we coalesce around projects, and it's this, it'll start out with the germ of an idea, and somebody will come in and we'll say, okay, like who's, you sort of take a guess at who should be involved in the initial discussions. And then you have initial discussions, people bat around things, and then you'll say, okay, well, that's interesting. We need to know more about blank, blank, and blank. And then, people go away, and they figure out blank, blank, and blank, and then they come back, and then we do it again. And then that in turn leads to other questions and other things, and then we keep sort of repeating that process in an iterative, fashion, until ultimately, a decision is reached. And in which case, sometimes there are contingents. Well, if this happens, then do this. If that happens, then do that. Other times, and it's, well, as long as you get these things done, you can go execute against the plan. And then come back if there's a problem. And, sometimes people come back and sometimes they don't. And, everybody has the freedom to execute, against the plan, unless the the major constraints of the plan, will be violated or whatever. And I think, as I said, we do this around projects. We also have certain standing, I said there's no standing meetings, but like our reserve meeting that we do every quarter, we go through this process, and we sort of set aside a day or two for all the different subgroups to come in and present their ideas for changes to the reserve or addition to the reserve or taking reserves off, and then all that's debated together. So we, that's part of the cycle reporting cycle. So we do that on a cycle basis. We also have another thing which I'll get into, which is process improvement projects, which we also, by their nature, those funnel into the quarter. So there's a scanning, and it's interesting how all these things are kind of similar, where we scan the environment for process improvement opportunities, then they get cataloged on a list through a separate process that we have, and then those are brought into this quarterly meeting where we essentially prioritize them, by an ROI type of metric. It's nothing so fancy as that, but it's basically, how hard is it to do versus how much benefit will it generate, and then we try to, secure, commitments and resources around those projects. And I think, one of the things that, is sort of creating an environments that are, conducive to this process is people have to feel it's fair as best as it can possibly be. And safe. And it's all about creating a sense of safety, and we really work hard on this. And of course we get it wrong, sometimes, and, more often than we'd like, for sure. And, it's around, try to be truth seeking. So it's not about who says stuff, it's about what's said. I think, people try to be analytically, rigorous around things. Listen, like we have a lot of things where, if somebody says something, depending on if we end up with a lot of heated debates and whatnot. And, one obligation that you have, in certain situations is to basically, if somebody else is making a point, is that before you make your point, you actually explicitly repeat back the other person's point, so that person will feel, they'll know that, that they've been understood. And then they will listen to, what the counterpoint is. And so we've sort of developed a whole lot of, kind of cultural techniques around that stuff. But really, there's no magic about any of that. I think it all comes down to, do people feel like it's safe and fair, so that, they then contribute, when they should contribute. And it's sort of interesting because I spend a tremendous amount of time and effort personally, and I think everybody does this within the organization now, which is trying to, create positive feedback loops so that, something gets off track, people, get the feedback they need in order to be effective, within the environment. So, and that's kind of our thing. The last thing I'll sort of mention is which I put specially here, but it's something we call the continuous improvement cycle. Again, something we didn't invent, but one thing that, I came up as a tax planning person with all the analytics and everything. And I remember thinking process was anathema, and that people come up on the compliance provision side are probably just the opposite of that. But, and I remember being at my last firm, and the legal group sent out some document that we were all supposed to read called the Policy on Policies. I remember getting that thing and thinking, oh my God, I'm just going to kill myself, because this is completely gone berserk. But it's interesting, since then I've become an incredible convert around this area, and part of it's being at Oracle and sort of getting on my radar. And then I read a bunch of books about process improvement, and GE has their Six Sigma and all this stuff. And I don't think the particular flavor matters, but we've devoted a tremendous amount of resources to getting better at everything. Try to do it, get better at everything we do. And we basically have hired a number of people with systems expertise and process expertise, and there's a whole toolkit of stuff that goes with that, who are basically sort of charged with supporting the organization in getting better. And that's given rise to this process improvement project process. And again, I think it sort of cycles back into conducive environment and safety, in that it's about obviously the main thing, the number one thing, and I think it's obvious to everybody, is that it's about, looking for solutions. So when something went wrong, the only thing that gets really, it gets not rewarded here, just to understate the case, is if people try to cover up or not just say what happened, because it doesn't, as long as we don't repeat the mistakes, it's about, look, let's all acknowledge that we have this problem. It doesn't matter who caused it or any of that stuff. Who cares about that? Because the only thing that matters is, how do we get better? And if people don't feel safe, they don't contribute in that process. And I'm not saying we get that right all the time either, but there's a lot of focus, put on that as well. So anyway, so that's my basic summary on, the third leg of this stool, which is, having gotten the right people who are, interested in pursuing this whole thing, and having defined sort of the overarching objectives. How do we establish the process to try to get, the best decision making and buy-in around executing against the purpose with the people. So that's sort of the whole. And again, I've sort of talked a lot here, and I guess we have a few minutes to talk about additional questions or whatever.
Greg, this is Tony. I just wanted the team and the people who will be listening to the audio who couldn't make it. There's a number of them that wish they could have. That called me, and they're going to be listening to this over the next day or two. To grasp and understand that the one thing I've noticed from Greg in the decades I've worked with him, he's always had a clear understanding of the kind of people he wants on the team. So the clarity of his objectives, intellectually curious, people who also need to understand like he does. He has this, as you said, you want to understand how everything works. Even if I'm doing a search for you, you want to understand how the hell we're going to do it in detail. And that's part of your makeup. This attention to rigor, analytics, and getting the data, making sure we look for what could go wrong. You know what kind of people you want, and you've now developed an interviewing style to ensure that you're less likely to make a mistake applying that, similar to what Mark did at BNSF, which I think is perfect. You've aligned that to the culture you've developed at the back end, your third leg, and you talk about process, to where the culture there, where you want people to dialogue, where you want people who want to debate, is also part of what kind of people you look for. And then you create a safe enough environment for them, teach them some tools to do it in a push-pull type of manner like you described there before, acknowledge what you heard before you respond. That is leadership, in my opinion. And somebody might have a different culture. They might have different attributes they're looking for. That's fine as long as they flow together. And of course, they align with the company's objectives, right in the middle that you talk about. But I think there's a lot to be understood here in a short period of time. But boy, oh boy, if you get it, life's going to be a lot easier for you as a leader in any organization you get into. I just wanted to tie that in from my perspective, seeing literally thousands of tax shops and how important this is.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Like, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think it's a great summary.
So I think we might have some questions. Shannon, do we have any before we need to break on this here?
Yeah, we have one more question I got in beforehand. So this person says, I'm currently managing a small team now. How do I learn how to manage a large team? Are there any tips to use when managing a large team versus a smaller team?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I think fundamentally it's all the same. I mean, definitely it's true for me that I think when you have a small team, you can almost make up for your team and do everything yourself. I mean, I think, and not that everybody does do that, and you certainly should not do that, but it's pretty easy when you do that. And I think there probably are a fair number of people that succumb to that temptation. You know, when you have the larger team, by definition, it's sort of like what I said at the beginning, I think, where what your whole power is through leverage. It's actually not about you. It's about you setting the environment and having all the pieces and parts, fit together, consistent with the vision as Tony just, sort of summarized. And so I think, it is understanding that scaling problem, which is really what it is, and just being aware of it. But fundamentally, I don't think it's any different. I think if you're doing the right things on the smaller organization, it'll look similar on the large organization. If you're not doing the right things on the smaller organization, then you probably need to learn to scale up and do less yourself, essentially. And even though, like I said, I'm personally very involved in everything, I still do about 1% of what gets done around here. I know what it's getting done, but I don't do it myself. That's for sure.
Do we have any last questions before we break? All right. So on that note, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Sounds great. I was just going to say, Mark, I appreciate your insights on some of these things. Like I said, I got a couple takeaways myself, so much appreciated.
Yeah, Mark sent me a chat. He had to drop off about 5 minutes ago, but he really liked what he heard, and he's going to listen to the rest of it. So we'll follow up on his end. Greg, again, I can't thank you enough. Guys, Greg is extremely busy. He has not really touted himself at all, very humble. But I can tell you Greg's style works exceedingly well. When we built out the first data team, the core team at Oracle came over to Greg, reached out to him to want to work with him there, even though high cost of living, they don't pay through the roof, like he said. I was amazed he got them. I was happy for them. I was happy for him, but it has to do with what he said before. If you find the right kind of people with the culture you have, they're going to gravitate to it. And they do like to work as teams. His group certainly does, and they're comfortable in an open dialogue and debate, and they know he's got their back, so it works for him. The whole thing comes together. Thanks again, Greg. This was excellent. I really appreciate it. I know the team does here too as well.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Everyone will be getting the recording afterwards, and I'll be posting on the forum as well. All right. Thanks, everyone.